The morning started the way most important mornings do. Quietly, without warning, without any sense of what was coming. Carmen Wilson woke up at 5:15 without an alarm. That was just how she was built. Her twin sister, Kelly, was still buried under the covers, one arm hanging off the edge of the bed, her braids fanned out across the pillow like she hadn't moved a single inch since midnight. Carmen sat up, looked at her sister for a long moment, and then did what she always did. She reached over and pulled the blanket clean off the bed. Kelly screamed like she'd been shot. "Carmen, it is 5 in the morning." 5:16, Carmen corrected, already on her feet, already pulling her travel outfit from the back of the chair where she'd laid it the night before. "Our flight is at 8. Dad said we needed to leave by 6:30. Kelly sat up slowly, her eyes barely open, her voice a low grumble. "Dad also said we could sleep until 6. Dad is not the one who takes 45 minutes to do her edges." There was a pause. Then Kelly was out of bed. That was the thing about Carmen and Kelly Wilson. They were identical in almost every physical way. Same deep brown skin, same wide dark eyes, same sharp cheekbones that their mother always said came straight from her side of the family. But the moment either of them opened their mouth, you knew exactly which one you were talking to. Carmen led. Kelly observed. Carmen charged forward. Kelly took notes. Together, they had a way of moving through the world that people twice their age couldn't quite explain, like they had already figured something out that most adults were still working on. Their father, Davis Wilson, had raised them that way deliberately. Davis was not a man who arrived anywhere unannounced. When people heard his name, they straightened up. When his company, Wilson Technologies, filed a quarterly report, financial analysts cleared their schedules. He had built his empire from a 2-bedroom apartment in Atlanta with a second-hand laptop and a vision so clear and so relentless that it had turned into something that now employed over 14,000 people across 6 countries. He was 44 years old, the kind of black man whose presence in a room changed the temperature of it. And he had spent the last 11 years raising 2 daughters who knew in their bones, not just in their heads, that they deserved to take up space anywhere they chose to stand. He was not flying with them today. That was the part that mattered. Davis had a board meeting in New York that he could not reschedule, and Carmen and Kelly were traveling alone to Atlanta for their grandmother's 75th birthday, a woman who had told Davis in no uncertain terms that if those girls were not at her party, she would fly to New York herself and drag him there personally. So Davis had done what any reasonable man in his position would do. He had booked his daughters the best seats on the plane, packed their bags with everything they needed, gone over the emergency contacts 3 times, and handed Carmen a card that simply read, "If anyone gives you trouble, call me first and argue second." Carmen had read the card twice, folded it neatly, and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, where she kept things that mattered. The drive to the airport was easy. Their driver, Marcus, dropped them at departures just before 7, and the 2 girls moved through check-in with the calm efficiency of people who had been flying since they were old enough to walk. They knew which line to join. They knew how to handle their own luggage. They knew that the trick to getting through security quickly was to have your shoes off before you reached the bin and your laptop out before you reached the conveyor. Kelly bought a chocolate croissant at the terminal bakery. Carmen bought a water bottle and a pack of gum and spent 10 minutes standing at the window watching planes taxi on the runway while Kelly ate in peaceful silence beside her. "You nervous?" Kelly asked between bites. "About what?" "Flying alone." Carmen considered this. "No," she said finally. "Are you?" Kelly thought about it with the same seriousness. "A little, but mostly I'm thinking about Grandma's cake." "You think she's doing the lemon one again?" "She always does the lemon one." "Good." Gate C-12 was half full when they arrived, and boarding was already underway for first class. Carmen pulled both their boarding passes up on her phone. Her father had insisted on digital, said it was faster, and the 2 girls joined the line without any fuss. The gate agent smiled at them, scanned both passes, and waved them through with a cheerful, "Have a great flight, ladies." They walked down the jetway side by side, Carmen in the lead, Kelly one step behind and to the right, the way they always moved when they were going somewhere that required focus. The plane was a wide-body aircraft, clean and new-smelling, the kind of first class that had actual dividers between seats and enough legroom to stretch out completely. They found their row quickly. Seats 2A and 2B, window and aisle, left side of the cabin. There were 2 people in them. Carmen stopped. She looked at the seats. She looked at her phone. She looked at the seats again. The man in 2A was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, wearing a pressed blue blazer and the particular expression of someone who had never once in his life been told no, and fully expected that record to continue. His hair was silver at the temples. His watch caught the light from the overhead panel. The woman beside him in Kelly's seat 2B was similarly dressed for comfort and consequence, her blonde hair pulled back, a glass of champagne already in her hand even though the plane hadn't pushed back from the gate. Carmen took a breath. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and even. "I think you're in our seats." The man, Richard Melbourne, though Carmen did not know his name yet, did not look up immediately. He finished whatever he was reading on his phone, thumbed down the screen one more time, and then turned his head toward her with the slow, deliberate patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone small. "These seats are taken, little girls," he said. "Run along back to economy where you belong." And then he waved his hand. That wave, that single, casual, dismissive wave, like she was a gnat, like she was noise, like she was nothing. Carmen felt something tighten in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, but was something older and more complicated than either. She had felt it before. She knew what it was. And she had been raised by a father who taught her exactly what to do with it. She did not move. "Sir," she said, and her voice had not changed at all, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. "I have a boarding pass for seat 2A. My sister has a boarding pass for 2B. Those are our seats." Richard Melbourne finally put his phone down. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and something passed across his face that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't quite a frown. It was the look of a man recalibrating, reassessing, deciding how much this interruption was worth his time. "There must be some kind of mix-up," he said, with the tone of someone being very generous by engaging at all. "We were assigned these seats. Maybe yours are further back. Economy is very comfortable on this aircraft, I'm sure." "We're not in economy," Carmen said. "Carmen," Kelly said softly from behind her. "We're in first class," Carmen continued, her voice still level. "Still clear, seats 2A and 2B. I can show you our boarding passes." She held up her phone. Richard Melbourne looked at it the way someone looks at a parking ticket they fully intend to contest. His wife, Linda, leaned slightly forward to glance at the screen, then leaned back and said nothing. Her champagne caught the light. "I'm sure it's just a system error," Richard said. "These things happen. Why don't you find a flight attendant and they'll sort you out with alternate seats?" "These are our seats," Carmen repeated. "Young lady, these are our seats." The cabin had gone very quiet. Carmen could feel it, the awareness creeping through the surrounding rows. The way people in nearby seats had stopped looking at their phones and were now looking at this. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A woman behind them shifted in her seat. The quiet had a texture to it, thick and attentive and waiting. Kelly stepped forward until she was standing beside her sister. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, because that was who Kelly was. That was how they worked. And the two of them together in that aisle made a statement that didn't need words. Richard Melbourne looked at them both and something shifted in his expression. Not into kindness, but into a different kind of authority, the kind that reaches for backup. "Excuse me," he said, raising his hand toward the front of the cabin. "Excuse me, could I get a flight attendant, please?" The flight attendant who appeared was named Jennifer. Carmen would remember that name for a very long time. Jennifer was in her 30s, efficient-looking, with the practiced calm of someone who had managed 1,000 small dramas at 35,000 feet. She came down the aisle with a professional smile already in place, assessed the situation in a single glance, and then did something that would define the next several hours of her life. She looked at Richard Melbourne first. "Is there a problem, sir?" "These young ladies seem to be confused about their seats," Richard said. "They're claiming 2A and 2B, but we were assigned those seats. I think there may have been a computer error." Jennifer turned to Carmen and Kelly with an expression that was careful but already tilted, the kind of careful that leans in one direction before the conversation starts. "Can I see your boarding passes, girls?" Carmen handed over her phone without a word. Jennifer studied the screen. Something flickered across her face very briefly, an expression Carmen couldn't quite read, and then it was smoothed over again. "These passes do show 2A and 2B, Jennifer said slowly. "But I want to check with the gate to make sure there wasn't a duplicate assignment." "Sometimes the system, there's no duplicate," Carmen said. "Our father booked these seats 3 weeks ago in first class on this flight for us." "I understand that, sweetheart, but, please don't call me sweetheart." Jennifer blinked. The word had landed cleanly, not rudely, but with a precision that left no room for debate. Carmen was not rude. She was never rude, but she was exact, and exactness in an 11-year-old had a quality that made adults uncomfortable in ways they couldn't immediately name. "My apologies," Jennifer said, and the apology was genuine enough that Kelly quietly noted it. "I just want to make sure we have the right information. Could I ask, are your parents on this flight?" "Our father is in New York for a board meeting," Carmen said. "Our mother passed away 2 years ago. We are traveling alone with his full knowledge and permission to our grandmother's 75th birthday party in Atlanta. Our emergency contact is our father, Davis Wilson, and these are our seats." The name Davis Wilson landed somewhere in the air between them. Jennifer's expression didn't change, but something happened behind her eyes. A small internal motion, like a card being turned over and examined and then set face down again on the table. Richard Melbourne, who had been listening to this entire exchange with the mildly satisfied air of someone watching a bureaucratic inconvenience being handled, now spoke again. "Look," he said, "I think the simplest solution here is for the airline to upgrade these girls' seats, or their existing seats are probably just fine, and this is all a misunderstanding. We have a flight to catch. Can we sort this out?" "We are sorting it out," Carmen said, and she turned back to Jennifer. "I would like to speak to your supervisor, please." Jennifer's jaw tightened just barely, just for a moment. "I'm sure that's not necessary." "It clearly is," Carmen said, "because you haven't asked the gentleman occupying my seat to show you his boarding pass. You've asked me to justify my presence here. So yes, I would like to speak to your supervisor." The cabin had gone even quieter than before. Somewhere in the rows behind them, someone coughed. Someone else shifted their weight. A man in 3A, who Carmen had not yet noticed, had his phone out under his tray table, angled slightly upward. He was recording. Jennifer did not call her supervisor immediately. She asked Carmen and Kelly politely, professionally, firmly if they would mind waiting in the boarding area while she verified the seat assignments. Carmen said she did not mind, if Jennifer would also ask the gentleman in 2A to step out while the verification occurred. Jennifer said that wouldn't be necessary. Carmen said, "Then I'll wait here." It was Kelly who finally spoke. And when she did, her voice was so quiet and so measured that it carried in the silence the way a pin drop carries in an empty room. "If those were 2 adult white passengers standing here," Kelly said, "would you be asking them to wait in the boarding area?" No one answered. No one had to. The question answered itself. Richard Melbourne, for the first time, looked slightly uncomfortable. His wife, Linda, had stopped sipping her champagne. Jennifer was holding Carmen's phone like it had become something heavier than it was when she first took it. The silence stretched, and then it broke because Carmen's phone buzzed in Jennifer's hand. Jennifer looked down at the screen automatically, the way anyone does when a phone buzzes. She saw the name on the incoming call. She saw it, and then she looked up at Carmen, and in that single moment, something changed. Not everything, not yet, but something in the exact tilt of her expression. She handed the phone back. On the screen in bold letters was the name Dad, Davis Wilson. Carmen looked at it. She looked at Jennifer. She looked at Richard Melbourne, who was looking at the screen too, though from far enough away that he couldn't read it clearly. She answered the phone. "Hi, Dad." Davis Wilson's voice came through clearly, warm and unhurried. The voice of a man who had learned long ago that the best way to assert power was to never sound like you were asserting anything at all. "Hey, baby, you boarded?" "Okay. I just saw the flight status update. We're on the plane," Carmen said. "We're having a situation. A beat. Just one beat. Tell me." Carmen did not look at Richard Melbourne while she spoke. She looked straight ahead at the galley wall at the front of the cabin, her voice steady and factual, laying out the situation with the precision of someone who had been coached her whole life to lead with facts and follow with feelings. She told him about the seats, about the wave of the hand, about Jennifer asking them to wait while the man who had taken their seats was permitted to stay, about the question Kelly had asked that no one had answered. When she finished, there was a silence on the other end of the line. It was a very particular kind of silence, the kind that precedes a decision already being made. "Put the flight attendant on the phone," Davis said. Carmen turned to Jennifer, who had been listening to the entire summary with an expression that had moved through several phases: professional concern, private doubt, something that might have been guilt, and held the phone out. "My father would like to speak with you." Jennifer took the phone. She said hello with the voice of someone who already suspected this call was not going to go the way most calls go. She listened for 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, her posture changed. Her shoulders changed. The hand that wasn't holding the phone came up and touched the side of her neck briefly and then dropped. "Yes, sir," she said. "I understand, sir." A pause. "No, sir. Yes, I hear you." Another pause, longer this time. "Of course. Yes, right away." She lowered the phone. She looked at Richard Melbourne. She looked at Linda Melbourne. She looked at Carmen and Kelly Wilson standing in the aisle of first class with their boarding passes and their matching travel outfits and 11 years of being raised to know their worth. And then, for the first time since this conversation had started, the balance shifted. "Mr. Melbourne," Jennifer said, her voice careful, her face carefully composed. "I'm going to need to ask you and your wife to come with me." Richard Melbourne stared at her. "I beg your pardon. These girls' seats have been confirmed as 2A and 2B. Your booking shows a different row. There appears to have been an error in how you were directed to these seats at boarding. If you'll come with me, we'll get you sorted out." Richard Melbourne did not move. For 5 full seconds, he did not move. His face went through something. Surprise, confusion, indignation, and then finally that particular shade of red that belongs to powerful men who have never been redirected in their lives. "We are not moving," he said. "We were told these were our seats. Sir, we have been seated. We have our drinks, and I am not going to be moved because some..." He stopped himself. Just barely stopped himself. But Carmen heard it, Kelly heard it, Jennifer heard it, the man in 3A with his phone angled upward heard it. Everyone heard what Richard Melbourne almost said. And in that half second of almost, Richard Melbourne's story changed forever, because now it wasn't about seats anymore. Carmen held her father's phone against her ear. "Dad," she said quietly. "He just almost said something." "I heard," Davis said, and his voice had changed. The warmth was still there underneath, the way a floor is still there underneath a rug. But what was on top now was something else entirely, something flat and focused and absolute. "Carmen, listen to me. Don't argue anymore. Just stand there. I'm making a call, okay?" she said. "You are not moving from that aisle. I know, Dad. I love you. I love you too." She lowered the phone and stood in the aisle of row 2 in first class. And she did not move. And Kelly stood beside her. And neither of them said a word. And the whole cabin waited. And somewhere at 30,000 feet, no, not yet, they hadn't even pushed back from the gate. Somewhere in the charged and breathless silence of that aircraft, the first domino had already fallen. Richard Melbourne just didn't know it yet. He would very, very soon know it. Davis Wilson's voice on that phone had been quiet. That was the part Jennifer couldn't shake as she stood in the galley between the first-class cabin and the cockpit door, her back to the passengers, her hand pressed flat against the wall like she needed something solid to hold onto. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't threatened. He had simply told her in a voice as level and certain as a man reading numbers off a ledger exactly who he was, exactly what he owned, and exactly what was going to happen in the next 10 minutes if those two girls were not seated in 2A and 2B before this plane moved an inch. She had worked for Meridian Airlines for 9 years. She had handled drunken passengers, medical emergencies, a man who tried to open the exit door over the Pacific. She had never once in 9 years felt her hands go cold the way they went cold during that phone call. Her supervisor, Gary Trask, was standing beside her now, his arms crossed, his expression somewhere between annoyed and alarmed because Jennifer had pulled him from the boarding door with an urgency that was not like her at all. "He said he's a 15% shareholder of Meridian," Jennifer said, keeping her voice low. 15%, Gary. Gary looked at her. "You don't know that's true." He said his name was Davis Wilson. Gary's arms unfolded very slowly. "Wilson Technologies, Davis Wilson." Jennifer looked at him and didn't say anything because the look said it all. Gary Trask pulled out his own phone. In the cabin, exactly 40 feet away, Richard Melbourne was not a man accustomed to waiting. He had reclined slightly in seat 2A, Carmen's seat, the seat his hand had claimed and his arrogance had defended. And he was doing the thing that men like Richard Melbourne always do when they sense a situation is not resolving in their favor. He was escalating the framing. He was turning to the passengers around him, to the couple in 3C and 3D, to the older gentleman across the aisle, as if building a silent jury. "Can you believe this?" he said, low enough to be confidential, loud enough to be heard. "Two children holding up an entire flight over a seating mix-up. There are 50 people on this plane. The man across the aisle said nothing. He looked at his magazine. The couple in 3C kept their eyes forward. Carmen, standing 3 feet from Richard Melbourne with Kelly beside her, heard every word. She did not respond. She had her father's instructions in her head like a compass setting. Don't argue anymore. Just stand there. And she stood there, still, upright, her hands loose at her sides, her face carrying an expression that was so controlled it was its own kind of statement. Kelly beside her was doing the thing she always did when Carmen was holding the line. She was watching, taking inventory. The man in 3A whose phone had been angled low since this started. The woman in 4B who kept looking up and then quickly down. The older black couple in row 5 who had not looked away at all, who were watching Carmen and Kelly with an expression that was recognition and sorrow and something fiercer than either. Carmen, Kelly murmured, barely moving her lips. I see him, Carmen said. She meant the man in 3A and his phone. He's been recording since the boarding pass thing. Carmen said nothing, but something settled in her expression. Something that looked very briefly like her father. It was now 7:48 a.m. The flight was scheduled to push back at 8:05. Gary Trask came back through the galley curtain. Jennifer was one step behind him. Gary was a tall man, competent looking, the kind of face that inspired institutional confidence, and he was currently wearing an expression that Jennifer had never seen on him in 4 years of working the same routes. He looked like a man who had just learned something very expensive. He stopped at row 2. He looked at Richard Melbourne. He looked at Carmen and Kelly. He looked at the boarding passes Jennifer had pulled up on her tablet. Both confirmed, both showing 2A and 2B. Davis Wilson's account, premium first-class booking, paid in full 11 weeks prior. Mr. Melbourne, Gary said. Richard looked up. Finally, someone with some authority. Could you please escort these girls to their correct seats so we can? Your booking, Gary said, shows seats 4A and 4B. The cabin went so quiet that the ventilation system was suddenly audible. Richard Melbourne's expression did not change at first. It held its position the way a wall holds its position right before it cracks. I'm sorry, seats 4A and 4B. Sir, your travel agent appears to have. There may have been a miscommunication at check-in. You were directed to the wrong seats. We were told these were our seats by the gate agent, and we apologize for that confusion. But these seats belong to these 2 young ladies, and I need to ask you and your wife to move to your confirmed seats right now. Linda Melbourne set down her champagne glass. It made a small, precise sound in the silence. Richard Melbourne stood up. He was a big man. Carmen had not fully noticed how big until he was standing, taking up the space of the aisle, looking down at Gary Trask with the full weight of a man who had spent his entire adult life being deferred to and did not know how to process the alternative. I am not moving, Richard said. I am a Meridian Platinum Elite member. I have flown over 300,000 miles on this airline. I have been in this seat for 40 minutes. I am not moving because of a booking error that your staff made. And I am certainly not moving because 2 children, Mr. Melbourne, Gary's voice had found an edge. I need you to lower your voice. Don't tell me to lower my voice on an aircraft I have partially funded with my loyalty for 12 years. Sir, do you know what I do? Do you have any idea who I know exactly who you are, Mr. Melbourne, Gary said, and something in his delivery, a kind of flat, final certainty, stopped Richard mid-sentence. And I also know that this conversation is being recorded by at least 2 passengers in this cabin, and I am asking you one final time to take your confirmed seats in 4A and 4B. A beat. Then Richard Melbourne laughed. It was short and hard, and it had no humor in it at all. Fine, he said, fine. This is absolutely outrageous, and I will be filing a formal complaint the moment we land, but fine. He looked at Carmen as he stepped into the aisle. He looked at her the way people look at things they intend to finish dealing with later. Carmen looked back at him with steady, dark eyes and did not drop her gaze for a single second. He moved past her. Linda gathered her things with the stiff dignity of someone performing composure in public. She did not look at the girls at all. Carmen stepped into row 2. She took seat 2A. Kelly took 2B. They put on their seatbelts. Carmen looked out the window at the tarmac and exhaled once, slowly, through her nose. You okay? Kelly asked quietly. Yeah, Carmen said. Your hands are shaking. Carmen looked down. They were, slightly. She flattened them on her knees. Don't tell Dad that. Kelly almost smiled. He already knows. He knows everything. The thing about Davis Wilson that most people underestimated was this. He did not react. He responded. There was a difference, and that difference was the whole of who he was. While Jennifer and Gary were managing Richard Melbourne in row 2, Davis was already on his second phone call. Not the one to Jennifer, that was done. His second call was to a man named Arthur Cole, who was Meridian Airline's senior vice president of operations and who happened to owe Davis Wilson 2 significant professional favors dating back 4 years to a partnership negotiation that had gone in Arthur's favor primarily because Davis had chosen not to make it go the other way. The call lasted 4 minutes. At 7:56 a.m., 9 minutes before scheduled departure, Arthur Cole called Gary Trask directly. Carmen and Kelly did not know about this call. They were seated, belted in, Kelly looking at the cloud shapes forming outside the window, Carmen rereading the emergency card in the seat pocket with the focused concentration of someone who needed somewhere neutral to put her eyes while her heartbeat came back down. What they heard 6 rows back was Richard Melbourne's voice again. "You are not serious." Gary's voice, lower, harder to catch. Then Linda Melbourne. "This is a lawsuit. Do you understand that? This is a lawsuit." Then silence. Then the sound of bags being moved overhead. Then footsteps. Then the galley curtain moving. Kelly turned around. Carmen did not, but she watched Kelly's face, which was the next best thing. "They're gone," Kelly said. "Both of them. They took them off the plane." Carmen absorbed this. Off the plane. Gate agent met them at the door. "They're getting off." Carmen turned around then. Row 4 was empty. The Melbournes' bags were gone. Richard Melbourne was gone. Linda Melbourne and her champagne glass and her pearl necklace and her 12 years of watching her husband treat people like furniture, all of it gone. The man in 3A lowered his phone for the first time since boarding. He looked across the aisle at Carmen, and then he did something unexpected. He nodded just once, small and serious. The way you nod at someone who just did something that needed doing. Carmen nodded back. It was 8:03 a.m. The thing that happened next was not something anyone on that flight anticipated. The plane did not push back at 8:05. It did not push back at 8:10. By 8:15, the captain had come on the intercom with the information that they were experiencing a brief operational delay and that passengers should remain seated. The economy cabin had started the low murmur of people exchanging theories. 3 people in business class were on their phones. A child somewhere toward the back started crying and then stopped. Jennifer appeared at Carmen's row. She crouched down, bringing herself to eye level, which Carmen noted immediately as a different posture than the one she'd carried earlier. Earlier, she had stood over them. Now she was level. That shift cost something, and Carmen respected it. "I owe you both an apology," Jennifer said. Carmen waited. "I should have asked to see his boarding pass first. I should have. I didn't handle it correctly, and I'm sorry." Kelly, who was better at receiving apologies than Carmen, said, "Thank you for saying that." Carmen said, "Why didn't you?" Jennifer blinked. "Excuse me, why didn't you ask him first? He was the one in the wrong seats. Why did you ask us?" Jennifer opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. And here was the thing about Jennifer, and this was what made her different from Richard Melbourne, what kept her from being the villain of this story even though she had played a role in it. She didn't reach for an excuse. She sat with the question for a moment, then she said, "I don't have a good answer for that. I think I made an assumption, and it was wrong." Carmen looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay. Just okay. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but received." Jennifer stood and went back to the galley. And Carmen looked out the window again, at the tarmac, at the luggage carts moving and the ground crew in their yellow vests. And she thought about her father's voice on the phone, about the way it had sounded when it changed, about the distance between warm and cold, and how fast a voice could travel that distance when the situation demanded it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Davis, still on the ground. "I know. Stay seated. I'm handling the other part now." Carmen stared at the words "other part" for 5 full seconds. She typed back, "What other part?" 3 dots appeared. Then, "The recording, baby. Someone got the whole thing on video. It's already moving." Carmen put the phone face down on her knee. She looked at Kelly. "Kel, I saw," Kelly said. She had been reading over Carmen's shoulder. "Dad moves fast. He always moves fast. Are you scared?" Carmen thought about Richard Melbourne's hand closing around their boarding passes. The slow, deliberate crumple. The way he had looked at her when he did it. Not with anger, not even with contempt exactly, but with the comfortable, habitual ease of a man who had never once had to consider that she had the same right to be somewhere that he did. That was what had gotten under her skin. Not the anger, the ease. No, Carmen said, I'm not scared. Good, Kelly said. She turned back to the window. Because I think Dad just started a fire. She wasn't wrong. The video had been uploaded at 8:11 a.m., 7 minutes after the Melbournes were removed from the plane, by a man named Thomas Garrett, the passenger in 3A, who had not planned on recording anything that morning. He had planned on sleeping through the flight to Atlanta. But there are moments in life where you look up from where you are and see something happening that is too important to look away from. And this had been one of those moments for Thomas Garrett. And so he had done the thing that ordinary people with phones do when they witness the extraordinary. He had pressed record. The video was 43 seconds long. It captured Richard Melbourne's hand closing around the boarding passes. It captured the slow crumple. It captured the drop. It captured his voice saying, "They're in. Problem solved. Now get out of my sight." It captured Carmen's face, still, controlled, devastatingly calm for an 11-year-old. And it captured Kelly stepping forward to stand beside her sister without a word. The way soldiers step up, the way family steps up. By the time the plane finally pushed back from the gate at 8:34 a.m., 29 minutes late, the video had 40,000 views. By the time the wheels lifted off the runway, it had 200,000. In Atlanta, Davis Wilson's communications director, a sharp 29-year-old named Priya Khan, was already fielding calls from 3 media outlets. She had not called Davis yet to ask him what to do because she had worked for him long enough to know that she was not the first call he had made this morning, and that whatever was already in motion was already further down the road than the press calls on her desk. She sent him a text instead. "Media aware. Waiting for your guidance on statement." He responded in under a minute. "Nothing yet. Let it breathe. Let it breathe." That was Davis. He understood something that most people in his position never fully learned, which was that power applied too early closes doors, and power applied at the right moment opens rooms that didn't exist before. Richard Melbourne landed in a different city on a different airline, having been rebooked by Meridian at the gate with an efficiency that had felt to him like injury added to insult. He did not yet know about the video. His wife, Linda, was quiet beside him in a way she had not been quiet in years, and he interpreted this as solidarity, which was the kind of mistake men like Richard Melbourne make about the women beside them, right up until the moment those women decide they are done being quiet. Richard's phone buzzed with a news alert at 10:22 a.m. He read the headline, read it again, then read it a third time, the way you read something when your brain is actively refusing to process what your eyes are showing it. He looked up from his phone. Linda was already looking at him. "How bad?" she said. He turned the phone toward her. She read it. Her expression did not crumple or collapse. It did something quieter and more final than that. It simply closed, the way a door closes. And Linda Melbourne looked out the airplane window at the white expanse of clouds below them and did not speak again for the rest of the flight. Back in the air above them, 40 minutes ahead and 35,000 feet above Georgia, Carmen Wilson had fallen asleep against the window. She had not meant to. The adrenaline had dropped sometime after takeoff and taken her down with it. And now she was breathing slowly, her cheek against the window, her braids falling forward across her shoulder. Kelly sat beside her and did not sleep. Kelly sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought about what her sister had said earlier. "I'm not scared," and the precision with which she had said it, the total absence of performance in it. The way Carmen had always been able to say true things directly without dressing them up or down. Kelly was not like that. Kelly felt everything a beat behind Carmen, turned it over more, held it longer. She had been angry on that plane in a way Carmen hadn't been. Carmen's anger had gone cold and focused. Kelly's had gone deep and hot and was still sitting in her chest like an ember. She thought about the way Richard Melbourne had dropped those boarding passes on the floor. She thought about the ease of it. She took out the small notebook she carried everywhere, a habit she'd had since age 7, something her mother had started with her, and she wrote one line. She did not write a paragraph or a summary of her feelings. Just one line, the way she always did when something happened that was too big to fit in ordinary language. She wrote, "Today, someone learned that we were real." She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and looked out the window at the Georgia sky, blue and enormous and completely indifferent. And she thought about her grandmother's lemon cake. And she let herself, for the first time since the morning started, feel something close to peace. The flight attendant, Jennifer, came by with water and a small bag of pretzels, and she set them down on Kelly's tray table without a word. And when Kelly looked up, Jennifer gave her a nod that was more honest than anything she had said out loud. And Kelly took the water and said, "Thank you," and meant it. 3 rows behind them, the older black couple from row 5 were holding hands. The man had his eyes closed. The woman was watching Carmen sleep. And somewhere 35,000 feet below, on the tarmac of an airport that was already beginning to receive its first satellite trucks, a story that had started with a wave of one man's hand was about to become something that no hand, no matter how powerful, no matter how certain, no matter how accustomed to being obeyed, was ever going to be able to stop. The plane touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson at 10:47 a.m. And Carmen woke up the way she always woke from deep sleep, all at once, completely, like a switch being thrown. She straightened in her seat, looked at Kelly, and Kelly showed her the phone without a word. The number on the screen was 1.4 million views. Carmen stared at it. She had understood in an abstract way that the video existed. She had understood when her father texted "Let it breathe" that something was already moving. But 1.4 million was not abstract. 1.4 million was the kind of number that had weight, that had temperature, that meant the thing that happened in that first-class cabin at 7:30 in the morning had already traveled to places she would never be able to trace. "Comments," she said. Kelly handed her the phone. Carmen scrolled for about 15 seconds and then handed it back. Not because it was bad. Most of it wasn't bad. Most of it was people who were furious on her behalf, strangers who had never met her, pouring real emotion into text boxes at 10 o'clock in the morning. But because reading about yourself in the third person while you are still in the same clothes you were wearing when the thing happened is a deeply strange experience. And Carmen Wilson, for all her composure, was still 11 years old. And she needed a minute. "Dad land yet?" she asked. "His flight from New York gets in at 2, Kelly said. "Marcus is picking us up now. Grandma knows we're coming." "Does Grandma know about?" "Yes." Carmen closed her eyes briefly. Their grandmother, Eleanor Wilson, was a woman who had lived through things that made Richard Melbourne look like a minor inconvenience in the long American catalog of major ones. Eleanor was 75 years old tomorrow, and she had been waiting for those girls with lemon cake and open arms. And Carmen could already hear in her head exactly what Eleanor was going to say when she saw them. She was going to hold Carmen's face in both her hands, and she was going to say, "Your mother would be so proud." And Carmen was going to have to hold herself together for that, which was going to take every bit of the same discipline she'd used in that cabin. She took a breath. She picked up her bag. She followed Kelly off the plane. By 11 a.m., the story had a name, not one that anyone had chosen. It had generated itself the way stories do when they hit the internet with enough velocity. People were calling it the boarding pass video, and the 43 seconds of Thomas Garrett's footage had been sliced and reposted and quoted, tweeted, and broken down frame by frame until every second of it existed in dozens of different contexts. The moment of the crumple, the drop, Carmen's face, Kelly stepping forward, Richard Melbourne's mouth forming "Get out of my sight." That phrase, "Get out of my sight," had become its own current. People were putting it on graphics. People were using it as a caption under photos of themselves in places they had been told, explicitly or otherwise, that they did not belong. A teenager in Chicago posted a photo of herself in her school's honors class with the caption, "Get out of my sight." A black doctor in Houston posted a photo from her hospital's boardroom. A grandmother in Mississippi posted a photo from her church's front pew, the one her family had been told for decades was not for them. None of this had reached Carmen yet. She was in a car with Kelly and Marcus, moving through Atlanta traffic, looking out the window at a city that was going about its ordinary Thursday morning. And she was thinking about her mother. She thought about her mother more than she told people. That was the thing about grief at 11. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the middle of ordinary moments and sits down beside you like it owns the seat. She thought about her mother now because her mother would have been on that plane. Her mother would have been the one seated in 2B, and Richard Melbourne would never have dared. Not because her mother was less herself than Kelly or Carmen, but because there is something about a parent's presence that changes the arithmetic of a confrontation, that adds a variable powerful people calculate before they act. Without her mother, they had been alone, and they had handled it. And that was something, Carmen thought. That was a real something. But it still sat beside the other thing, the quieter, older ache. And the two of them shared the backseat of her thoughts the whole drive to Eleanor's house. It was 11:23 a.m. when Marcus pulled up to Eleanor Wilson's home in Cascade Heights, a neighborhood that had its own history in Atlanta, its own weight. The kind of block where 3 generations of the same family could point to the same oak tree and tell you something about who they were. Eleanor was on the porch before the car stopped. She had seen them coming from the window, the way grandmothers always know, and she came down the porch steps with her arms already open and her face already doing what Carmen had predicted it would do. She held Carmen first, then Kelly, then Carmen again, and she didn't say anything for a full minute, which was somehow more powerful than anything she could have said. Then she held Carmen's face in both her hands, and Carmen braced herself, and Eleanor said, "Your mother is sitting right here on this porch watching everything, and she is not surprised by one single thing you did." Carmen held herself together. She did, but it was close. Inside Eleanor's house, the television was on, and the television was showing a news ticker that read, "Viral video sparks outrage. Billionaire's daughters removed from first-class seats." Eleanor turned the volume down when they came in but didn't turn it off. And Carmen noticed this and understood it. Eleanor was not the kind of woman who looked away from things. She was the kind of woman who turned the volume down so she could hear what the people in the room were saying while keeping one eye on what the world was doing. "Sit," Eleanor said. "Eat first. Everything else can wait 20 minutes. Kelly did not argue. Carmen did not argue. They sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, which had a particular quality of solidity to it, the kind of table that had witnessed 75 years of family history being made and processed and survived. And they ate scrambled eggs and toast and orange juice while Eleanor sat across from them and watched them eat with an expression that contained multitudes. It was 11:41 a.m. In a conference room in Midtown Atlanta, a man named Bernard Okafor was on the phone with 3 people simultaneously. Bernard was Davis Wilson's lead attorney, and he was the kind of lawyer who made other lawyers nervous. Not because he was aggressive, but because he was patient. And patience in a lawyer is a quality that only activates when there is something serious enough to be patient about. He was currently being patient about several things at once. The first was Meridian Airline's legal team, which had called at 10:15 a.m. to begin what they framed as a proactive dialogue regarding the morning's incident. Bernard had listened to their opening for 4 minutes and then said quietly that Davis Wilson's position would be communicated through appropriate channels in due course and had ended the call. The second was a civil rights organization whose director had reached out through Davis's communications office wanting to partner on a formal statement. Bernard had said he would pass the message along. The third and most interesting was a call from a journalist at a national newspaper who had obtained, through means Bernard did not yet know, a copy of Richard Melbourne's professional profile and who wanted Davis's team to confirm or deny certain details about Melbourne's business dealings. Bernard confirmed nothing and denied nothing. He said thank you, wrote down 3 things, and called Davis. Davis picked up on the first ring. "Melbourne has a history," Bernard said. "What kind?" "Employment discrimination complaint. 2019, settled out of court. 2 former employees, both black women. His company's called Briar Capital, commercial real estate based in Sydney with U.S. operations." The journalist has the complaint documents. Silence on Davis's end. Then, "Did we find it, or did they?" "They found it. We confirmed nothing." "Good." A pause. "Don't touch it. Let them run it on their own." Bernard nodded even though Davis couldn't see him. "The airline's lawyers called." "I know. Arthur Cole called me directly." First. Another pause. "How's the video?" Bernard looked at his screen. 2.1 million as of 8 minutes ago. Davis absorbed this. "The girls landed. 11:47. They're at your mother's." "Good." And here, beneath the strategy and the calculation and the cold authority that Davis Wilson had deployed all morning, like a chess player moving pieces, something human surfaced briefly in his voice. Something that was just a father. "They okay?" Carmen held it together on the plane, "from what I understand." "Kelly too." "Of course they did," Davis said, and the pride in it was total and quiet and real. Then it was gone, and he was back. "I need the airline's full incident report on my desk before I land. I need Jennifer, what's her name's employment record, and Gary Trask. And I need to know if the gate agent who told Melbourne he was in 2A and 2B was negligent or complicit." "Those are 2 different conversations." "Understood." "Davis," Bernard paused. "The media cycle is moving fast. Priya is going to need guidance soon. Tell Priya to post 1 thing. Just 1. A photo. Carmen and Kelly at the gate before any of this happened, from our security camera footage if we have it. No caption except the date and their names. Nothing else." Bernard wrote it down. "You sure?" People are going to want a statement. The photo is the statement, Davis said. 2 little black girls, their names, the date. Let people fill in the rest. At 12:08 p.m., Priya Khan posted the photo. Within 20 minutes, it had been shared 40,000 times. It was a simple image, timestamped 7:34 a.m. from the airport's security feed. Carmen and Kelly Wilson standing at gate C12 in their matching travel outfits, their bags on their shoulders, their boarding passes in Carmen's hand, their faces clear and unsuspecting and completely, heartbreakingly ordinary. 2 little girls going to their grandmother's birthday party. That was all. That was everything. The caption read, Carmen Wilson and Kelly Wilson. October 14th. Nothing else. The internet did not need anything else. Richard Melbourne, who had been sitting in a hotel room in a different city since his rebooked flight landed at 11:30 a.m., found out about the photo the same way he'd found out about the video, through a news alert on his phone. He was on his 4th call with his attorney by this point, and he had moved through the stages of this particular crisis with the speed of a man who has never been in a crisis before and therefore has no practiced equipment for it. He had gone from dismissive to defensive to indignant to something approaching actual fear in the span of about 3 hours, which was by any measure fast. His attorney, a man named Craig Holloway, who specialized in exactly this kind of reputational emergency, was trying to walk him through a containment strategy that required Richard to do 2 things he had never successfully done in his life. Stay quiet and wait. You cannot respond to the video, Craig said. Anything you say right now adds fuel. I'm being painted as a racist, Richard said. You are being painted as a racist because you crumpled 2 children's boarding passes and dropped them on the floor. Silence. Craig, Richard, I am telling you as your lawyer, as someone who has handled 100 of these, that the only move right now is silence. The moment you open your mouth, you become the story again. Right now, you're just in the story. There is a difference. Richard Melbourne looked at his phone screen. The photo of Carmen and Kelly at the gate was on his browser, and he had been looking at it for the last several minutes with an expression that his wife would have recognized and been troubled by if Linda had been in the room. But Linda was not in the room. Linda was in the bedroom with the door closed, and she had been there since they checked in, and she had not answered when he knocked an hour ago, which was a development that Richard Melbourne had not yet fully processed. My company is going to take a hit, he said. Your company is going to take a significant hit, Craig confirmed. The question is whether we manage that or whether we let it manage us. Right now, we wait. Davis Wilson is not waiting. Davis Wilson has 2 daughters who were treated badly on a plane. He has the moral high ground, the financial resources, and apparently the legal history of your 2019 settlement, which, Richard, why didn't you tell me about that? Another silence, longer. It was settled, Richard said. It was settled, and it is now on the front page of 3 websites, Craig said. I need you to understand that this is no longer a story about airplane seats. Richard Melbourne understood. He understood it the way you understand something when it is too late to do anything except understand it. It was 1:15 p.m. In Eleanor Wilson's living room, Carmen was asleep again on the couch, genuinely and deeply asleep this time, with Eleanor's old quilt pulled over her and the television muted in the corner. Kelly was at the kitchen table with her notebook open, but she wasn't writing. She was watching her grandmother move around the kitchen, the deliberate, unhurried way Eleanor did everything, like she had decided long ago that rushing was a form of letting the world set your pace and she was not interested in that arrangement. Grandma, Kelly said. Eleanor looked up from the stove. Were you ever treated like that? Like we were today? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She set down what she was holding. She turned to face Kelly fully, which was the thing Eleanor did when a question deserved her complete attention. Baby, she said, I was treated like that when there were laws that said it was legal. Kelly absorbed this. Does it stop? Kelly asked. Ever? Eleanor came to the table. She sat across from Kelly. She looked at her granddaughter for a long moment with eyes that had 75 years behind them, joy and grief and fury and survival and love. And she said, it changes. That's different from stopping. It changes when enough people decide they are done with it. What you and your sister did today, she paused. That was deciding. Kelly looked down at her notebook at the line she had written on the plane. Today, someone learned that we were real. She turned the notebook around and slid it across the table to Eleanor. Eleanor read it. She read it twice. Then she reached across and put her hand over Kelly's and held it. From the living room, Carmen's phone buzzed on the coffee table. Both of them looked at it. Kelly went to check it and came back with her face carrying something new. Not alarm, not excitement exactly, but the particular expression of someone reading a number that has crossed a threshold into a different category of reality. 4.7 million, she said. Eleanor nodded slowly. How many is that? 4,700,000 people, Kelly said, watching. Eleanor looked at the muted television, at the news ticker still running, at the photo of her granddaughters. She could see it on the screen, standing at a gate with their boarding passes, their whole ordinary day ahead of them, not knowing yet what was coming. Then they'll have to answer to 4,700,000 people, Eleanor said, and she said it with the calm certainty of someone who has been waiting her whole life for the world to get large enough to hold what she already knew was true. It was 1:34 p.m. Davis Wilson's flight from New York landed at 2:02 p.m. Marcus was at arrivals. Davis came through the doors carrying nothing but a phone and a jacket, moving with the particular economy of a man who has already thought through every step ahead of him. He got in the car, and Marcus handed him a tablet without being asked. Davis looked at it for the 3 minutes it took to exit the airport, reading quickly, flipping through items. Bernard's report, Priya's metrics, 4 media requests, the journalist's article, which had published at 1:47 p.m. with the headline, Briar Capital CEO has history of racial discrimination complaints amid viral airplane incident. He set the tablet down. He looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline. The girls, he said, at Mrs. Wilson's. Carmen slept most of the afternoon. Kelly's been writing. Davis smiled very briefly, very privately. Then it was gone. Meridian CEO called, Marcus said. Wants a personal conversation, not through lawyers. He can wait until Monday. And Jennifer, the flight attendant, she filed an internal complaint against her own supervisor this morning. Apparently, Gary Trask told her before the flight, and I'm quoting, they're just kids. Handle it quick before more of the cabin wakes up. She wrote it down after the fact. HR has it. Davis turned to look at Marcus. She filed it herself. 1 hour after landing, Davis looked back at the window. Something moved across his face that was harder to name than anger or satisfaction. Something more like recognition, like the world occasionally producing evidence of its own conscience. Make sure her employment is protected, he said. Whatever happens with Meridian's investigation, Jennifer doesn't lose her job over this. Her supervisor. Davis said nothing for a moment. That's different. It was 2:19 p.m. At 2:31 p.m., Carmen Wilson woke up on her grandmother's couch for the second time that day. She lay still for a moment in the particular warmth of Eleanor's quilt, listening to the sounds of the house, her grandmother's voice in the kitchen, Kelly's occasional quiet response, the muted television, the October afternoon going on outside like nothing had happened. She thought about the boarding passes, about the crumple and the drop in the floor, about standing in that aisle. She thought about what her father had said. You are not moving from that aisle. She hadn't. Neither had Kelly. And now 4.7 million people, she didn't know that number yet, she'd been asleep, were watching. And Richard Melbourne was in a hotel room somewhere trying to contain what could not be contained. And the airline was in damage control. And Jennifer had filed a complaint against her own supervisor. And the lemon cake was in Eleanor's kitchen waiting for tomorrow. Carmen sat up. She picked up her phone. She had 14 texts she hadn't read, a missed call from her father, and a notification from a news app that she had downloaded 2 years ago for a school project and had never deleted. She opened the notification. The headline stopped her cold. She read it 3 times. Then she stood up from the couch and walked to the kitchen doorway and stood there until Kelly looked up from her notebook and saw Carmen's face and said, "What?" Carmen turned her phone around. Kelly read it. Her expression went through several things quickly. Then she looked up at her sister and said the only thing there was to say. Dad already knew. Carmen nodded slowly. He let it happen on its own, Kelly said. He didn't push it. It found its own way. Carmen looked down at the headline one more time, at Richard Melbourne's name, at the words 2019 Settlement and Racial Discrimination in Briar Capital, and the 2 women, not girls, women, grown women with careers and names and lives, who had been through something years before that nobody had paid attention to until now, until 2 11-year-old girls stood in an aisle and refused to move. Carmen put her phone in her pocket. "Grandma," she said, "is the cake for tomorrow, or can we have some tonight?" Eleanor turned around from the stove with an expression that was lemon and love and 75 years of knowing that sometimes the most radical thing you can do after a hard day is sit down, eat something sweet, and let tomorrow come. Tonight, Eleanor said. Absolutely tonight. The lemon cake was everything Eleanor had promised and more. And they ate it at the kitchen table at 7:30 p.m. with the television still muted in the other room and Davis Wilson sitting at the head of the table, looking at his daughters like a man who had been reminded for the 100th time that day what everything he had ever built was actually for. He had arrived at Eleanor's house at 3:15 p.m. And the moment Carmen saw him come through the door, she had walked directly into his arms without a word. And he had held her there for a long time, his chin on top of her head, his eyes closed. And Kelly had come around and put her arms around both of them. And the three of them had stood in Eleanor's hallway in a knot of quiet and relief, while Eleanor watched from the kitchen doorway and said absolutely nothing, which was the most generous thing she could have offered. They did not talk about what had happened on the plane during dinner. That was Davis's decision, and it was the right one, and everyone at the table understood it without being told. Eleanor talked about the neighborhood. Kelly asked about a cousin in Charlotte. Davis ate 2 slices of cake and looked 10 years younger than he had looked at the airport. Carmen was quieter than usual, not troubled, not closed off, just processing in the particular interior way that was distinctly hers, the way she had processed things since she was small, sitting with the full weight of something before she let it out. It was after dinner when Eleanor and Kelly were doing dishes and Davis was sitting with Carmen on the back porch in the October evening that it finally came out. "Dad," Carmen said. "Yeah." When he dropped the boarding passes on the floor, she stopped. Davis waited. "He looked at me while he did it," she said. "He didn't look away. He wanted me to see it." Davis was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't absence but presence. The kind that says, "I am here, and I am holding this with you." "I know," he said. "I wasn't going to cry," Carmen said. "I want you to know I wasn't going to cry. I know that too." "I was angry," she said. "But it wasn't like regular angry. It was like I felt it before. That specific kind where someone looks at you and you can tell that you are not a full person to them. You're just a category." Davis turned to look at her, his daughter, 11 years old, sitting in the October dark with the city sounds around them, articulating something that took most people decades to put into language. He thought about his own mother, 30 feet away in the kitchen. He thought about what Eleanor had survived. He thought about the first time he had felt exactly what Carmen was describing. He had been 9, not 11. And it had been a teacher, not a stranger on a plane. And it had been a smaller moment in some ways and a larger one in others. And he had carried it inside him and built something out of it that employed 14,000 people and owned 15% of an airline. That feeling, Davis said carefully, is information. It tells you something real about the world. The question is what you do with it. "I stood there," Carmen said. "You stood there," he confirmed. "Kelly stood there with me." "She did." Carmen looked at her hands. "Is that enough? Just standing there?" Davis thought about this for a real moment, not a performed one. "Today, it was more than enough," he said. "Standing there, being seen, not moving. 4.9 million people watched that. Do you understand what that means? People who have been in that position their whole lives. People who were told to move and did because they didn't know they had the right not to. They watched 2 little girls hold their ground, and something happened for them. Something real." Carmen was quiet. Then she said, "Kelly wrote something on the plane. She showed me. She wrote, 'Today someone learned that we were real.'" Davis absorbed this. "That's your sister," he said softly. "Yeah," Carmen said. It was 8:47 p.m. In a hotel room in Charlotte, North Carolina, Richard Melbourne had not slept. He had been awake for 19 hours, and the shape of those hours had been the shape of a man watching the ground disappear beneath his feet in slow motion, unable to stop it, unable to reverse it, only able to watch. Craig Holloway had called 4 times. 2 of those calls Richard had answered. The last one at 7 p.m. Craig had said 3 words that Richard Melbourne would hear in his sleep for years if he slept, which tonight seemed unlikely. "Briar Capital is trending. Not Richard Melbourne is trending. Not the airplane video is trending. Briar Capital, his company, the thing he had built over 22 years, the company that had 47 employees and 3 major institutional clients and a deal in the pipeline that was supposed to close in 3 weeks. Briar Capital was trending on a Thursday evening in October because a journalist had connected a 43-second video of him crumpling 2 children's boarding passes to a 2019 discrimination settlement that he had paid $200,000 to make disappear quietly. It had not disappeared quietly. It was 9:03 p.m. when Linda Melbourne knocked on the hotel room door. Richard had not heard from her since she'd closed the bedroom door that afternoon, and he had assumed she was asleep. He opened the door and looked at his wife and immediately understood that she was not and had not been, and that something had shifted in her in the hours since the plane that was not going to shift back. She had her phone in her hand. She held it up. On the screen was the journalist's article, the one with the 2019 settlement. Richard looked at it and then looked at her face. "You knew," Linda said. "When those women filed, you knew what you'd done, and you paid to make it go away, and you never told me." Richard opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. "Don't do whatever you were about to do. I've been in that bedroom reading for 6 hours, and I am done with whatever you were about to do." The silence between them had a specific texture. The texture of a marriage at a particular junction, the kind of junction that people sometimes back away from and sometimes walk straight through. And which one it would be was entirely unclear to Richard Melbourne in that moment, which was itself a new experience because Richard Melbourne was a man accustomed to knowing what was going to happen. "Linda, I watched you drop those papers on the floor," she said. "I was sitting right there. I watched you do it to an 11-year-old girl, and I didn't say a word, and I have been sitting with that all day." Her voice was steady, which was somehow more disturbing than if it had broken. "I'm not going to be that person. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I am not going to be that person." She turned and went back to the bedroom. The door closed behind her. Not slammed, closed, precisely. Finally, with total control, Richard Melbourne sat down on the edge of the hotel bed and put his face in his hands. It was 9:11 p.m. In Atlanta, Davis Wilson's phone rang at 9:15 p.m. It was Bernard. Davis stepped off the porch and took the call in the hallway. He listened for 2 minutes without speaking, which was long for him. Then he said, "When?" Bernard said something. Davis said, "All three." Bernard said something else. Davis was quiet for 5 seconds. Then he said, "Don't respond tonight. Let me think." He ended the call and stood in Eleanor's hallway for a moment, looking at nothing. His mind doing the thing it did when it was working, going very still on the outside and very fast on the inside. Carmen appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had her father's ability to read a room without being told what was in it. "What happened?" she said. Davis looked at his daughter. He had a rule about this, about what he shared with his girls and what he held back, about the line between raising them to understand the world and burdening them with the adult weight of it before they needed to carry it. But Carmen was looking at him with those steady, dark eyes, and she had already carried more today than most adults carried in a year, and he decided she had earned the next sentence. "Meridian Airlines just suspended Jennifer and Gary Trask pending investigation," he said. "Both of them." Carmen's expression moved. "Jennifer filed a complaint against Gary." "I know. They suspended her anyway. Same action, different reasons, at least officially." He watched his daughter absorb this. "Jennifer is going to be okay. I've already told Bernard to make sure of that. But Gary Trask and 2 other people, including the gate agent who directed Melbourne to your seats, are facing termination." Carmen was quiet. Then, the gate agent told him he was in 2A and 2B on purpose. Unclear. Could have been negligence. Could have been something worse. That's what the investigation is for. Carmen looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked up. "What about the 2 women from 2019? From Melbourne's company?" Davis looked at her. "You read the article, while you were driving from the airport. Kelly showed me." Carmen held his gaze. "Are they okay? Do they know what's happening?" Davis was quiet for a beat. And in that beat, something passed across his face that he didn't usually let pass across his face in front of people. Something that was pride so deep it hurt. "One of them gave an interview this afternoon," he said. "She said she'd spent 5 years wondering if she should have fought harder. She said watching you stand in that aisle answered the question." Carmen pressed her lips together. She nodded once, very slightly, the way Davis nodded when something hit him hard and he was keeping it internal. "Okay," she said. She turned and went back to the kitchen. Davis stood in the hallway for another moment. Then he called Bernard back and said, "On second thought, draft the statement. Have it ready by 6 a.m. We'll decide in the morning." It was 9:34 p.m. By 10 p.m., the video had 7 million views, and Richard Melbourne's name had been mentioned in the same sentence as the 2019 settlement on every major cable news network that was still broadcasting. The story had completed the cycle that stories complete when they carry enough moral weight and enough visual evidence. It had moved from social media outrage to legitimate news coverage to the kind of sustained, slow-burning national conversation that doesn't peak and crash but instead settles in and stays, becoming part of the ongoing record of what a country is willing to tolerate and what it finally decides it is not. At 10:22 p.m., one of Briar Capital's institutional clients, a real estate investment trust based in Boston with $500 million in managed assets, sent a brief, formal email to Briar Capital's general contact address stating that they were reviewing their partnership agreements in light of recent developments and would be in touch. It was the most expensive email Richard Melbourne would ever receive, and he wouldn't see it until the next morning. Linda Melbourne in the bedroom was on the phone with her sister in Melbourne, Australia. Her sister said, "What are you going to do?" And Linda said, "I don't know yet." And her sister said, "Yes, you do." And Linda was quiet for a long time and then said, "Yes, I do." She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't need to. At 11 p.m. in Cascade Heights, Eleanor Wilson's house was quiet. Kelly was asleep in the guest room, properly asleep, under proper covers, with her notebook on the nightstand and the October night cool outside the window. Eleanor had gone to bed at 10 o'clock. She was 75 tomorrow, and she intended to meet it rested. And Davis was still up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his phone in the particular stillness of a man who has been running at full capacity all day and is finally, at the end of it, letting himself stop. Carmen came downstairs at 11:08 p.m. Davis looked up. "You should be asleep, I know." She sat down across from him. She had her notebook. She'd borrowed one of Kelly's, the spare Kelly always carried, and she set it on the table. "Dad," she said, "I want to do something." "What kind of something?" "I want to write a letter to the two women from Melbourne's company." From 2019. Davis looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. The house was quiet around them. Eleanor's clock on the wall ticking. The city outside going on in its nighttime way. "What do you want to say to them?" he said. Carmen opened the notebook. She had already started. She turned it so he could see the first lines written in her careful, precise handwriting. "I don't know if you'll ever see this. I'm 11 years old. I don't know everything that happened to you, but I know it was real, and I know you were right. And I know that nobody stood up then the way they should have." Davis read it. He read it twice. He set the notebook down on the table and looked at his daughter and did not speak for a full 10 seconds, which for Davis Wilson, who was by profession and nature a man of rapid decisions and faster words, was the loudest thing he could have done. "Finish it," he said. "I'll make sure they get it." Carmen nodded and pulled the notebook back and picked up her pen. Davis watched her write. It was 11:19 p.m. on October 14th. On November 22nd, Davis Wilson and Carmen and Kelly Wilson met with Senator Patricia Owens in Washington, D.C. They arrived at 9 a.m. The meeting lasted 3 hours, which was 2 hours longer than originally scheduled, and ran over because Carmen had questions. Precise, structured, quietly relentless questions about the legislation, about the oversight mechanism, about what enforcement actually looked like on the ground when the cameras were not rolling and the moment was not viral. And Senator Owens answered every one of them with the seriousness they deserved. And at one point turned to her chief of staff and said simply, "She should be in the room when we draft this." And her chief of staff nodded and wrote something down. And Carmen heard this and kept her face even and her voice level and stored it in the place where she kept things that mattered. Kelly sat beside her the whole meeting and asked 3 questions, each one landing at exactly the moment a question was needed, each one opening a door in the conversation that the room had been about to walk past. Senator Owens told Kelly after the meeting that she had the instincts of a strategist. And Kelly said, "My sister does the strategy. I do the listening." And Owens said, "In my experience, the listener is half the strategy." And Kelly filed that away in her notebook that evening, word for word. The legislation, the Passenger Protection and Anti-Discrimination Enforcement Act, was introduced on January 8 of the following year with 11 co-sponsors, 4 of whom had previously declined to sign on and had changed their positions in the 3 months since October 14. Senator Owens named the founding principle in her floor statement. She quoted Davis Wilson's statement directly. "You are exactly where you belong. Stand there. Do not move." The chamber was not full because they rarely are for a Thursday morning floor statement, but the people who were there were paying attention. And the ones who were paying attention understood that this was one of those moments where the ordinary business of legislation briefly aligns with something larger than itself, with the accumulated weight of all the ordinary moments that had made it necessary. Carmen Wilson watched the floor statement on her laptop at Eleanor's kitchen table during winter break with Kelly beside her and Eleanor behind them with her coffee and her reading glasses and her 75 years of context for exactly this moment. When it was over, Eleanor said, "Your grandfather marched for 30 years and never saw this get this far this fast." She said it without bitterness and without excessive pride, the way facts are stated when you have lived long enough to understand that facts are complicated and partial and real all at once. Carmen looked at the screen for a moment. Then she opened her notebook to a blank page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote one line. Kelly leaned over to read it. The line said, "We are not done yet." Kelly read it. She nodded once. She picked up her own pen and on her own notebook page wrote the same date and then wrote below it her line from the plane. "Today, someone learned that we were real." And then beneath that she added one new line. "And tomorrow, they will not forget it." Outside Eleanor's window, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta always does in January, pressing forward, moving through, carrying its history and its future in the same arms, the way cities that have survived things always do. Somewhere in that city, people were getting on planes. People were sitting in seats they had paid for. Seats they deserved. Seats that were simply and completely and without qualification theirs. And somewhere in the long, imperfect, still unfinished project of building a country that actually meant what it said, 2 11-year-old girls had added one small, indelible, recorded moment to the record. The moment of standing still in an aisle, of not moving, of looking back at the man who expected you to flinch and showing him clearly and permanently that you were not going to. That moment was 43 seconds long. It was 7 million views. It was 11 co-sponsors on a piece of legislation. It was Sandra Mensah choosing to put down a weight she had been carrying for 5 years. It was Thomas Garrett, who had almost looked away and didn't. It was Jennifer, who had gotten there a minute late but had gotten there. It was Eleanor Wilson at 75 drinking her coffee, watching her granddaughters write in their notebooks, understanding without needing it explained that what she was looking at was not the end of something but the beginning of the next thing. The same thing continued, carried forward by different hands, into a future that owed its shape in part to an ordinary October morning when 2 little girls stood in an aisle and refused, absolutely and without apology, to move. Carmen Wilson closed her notebook. She was 11 years old, and she had already changed something real about the world. And she knew it, and she was not finished. And she knew that too. Some people are born for ordinary lives and choose extraordinary ones. Some people have the extraordinary thrust upon them in the space of 43 seconds in a first-class cabin on a Thursday morning. Carmen and Kelly Wilson were both kinds of person at once, chosen and choosing, acted upon and acting, standing still and moving forward in the same breath. They had not asked for the wave of Richard Melbourne's hand. They had not asked to be the one standing in that aisle at that moment with those boarding passes and that particular, precise, absolute refusal to be less than what they were. But they had been there, and they had held their ground. And the world, in all its slowness and difficulty and occasional, hard-won grace, had shifted just slightly, just measurably, just enough. Because they did.